He was only our father. He was your husband, so he needs you more than us. Those were my daughter's last words before they hung up. The phone went dead in my hands, and I stared at it like it might ring again, like maybe they'd call back and say they were joking. But the silence stretched on, thick and suffocating, filling every corner of our bedroom where George lay dying. The next day, I stood alone in front of my husband's coffin. 5 empty chairs lined the front row, chairs I had asked the funeral director to set up for my daughters and grandchildren. One trembling widow, that's all that remained. The pastor's voice cracked through the silence, stumbling over words about love and family, and even the wind outside seemed ashamed to stay, rattling the windows like it wanted to escape this hollow mockery of a farewell. No daughters. No grandchildren. Just me and the sound of dirt falling on a man they once called Dad, once climbed onto his lap for bedtime stories, once begged to push them higher on the swings he built with his own hands. The same hands that worked double shifts to pay for their college, their weddings, their down payments on houses they never invited us to visit. That night, I sat in our living room, his chair still warm from where he'd spent his last conscious hours, his slippers still by the rug where he'd kicked them off Tuesday morning when the pain got too bad to walk. I told myself they'd call. They didn't. The phone sat silent on the table next to his reading glasses, the ones he'd been too weak to put on in those final days when even the newspaper became too heavy for his failing hands. But the next morning, something changed. I heard them crying at my doorstep, all 3 of my daughters with their phones in their hands, screens glowing even through their tears. Not because they missed him, not because they finally realized what they'd lost, but because they had finally seen what the world now knew. The story had somehow made its way online. A neighbor had posted about the funeral, about the empty chairs, about the widow who buried her husband alone while his daughters chose convenience over love. The comments were brutal. Strangers were calling them heartless, selfish, ungrateful. Their own friends were asking questions they couldn't answer. Their husbands were looking at them differently. And suddenly, finally, they wanted to talk about Dad. I opened the door and looked at these 3 women, Sarah, 38, Jennifer, 41, and Michelle, 44, my babies who had grown into strangers. Their faces were puffy, their makeup smeared, but I could see the glow of their phone screens reflecting in their eyes even as they tried to focus on me. "Mom," Sarah started, her voice breaking in that practiced way she'd perfected since high school drama club. "We didn't know people would react like that. We thought you'd understand. You know how busy we've been, how hard it is with the kids and work and everything." I stood there listening to her words, watching her sisters nod along, and I realized something that cut deeper than their absence at the funeral. They weren't mourning. They were embarrassed. They weren't sorry George was gone. They were sorry the world knew they hadn't cared enough to show up. "We want to make this right," Jennifer said, and I noticed she was holding her phone at an angle, recording their own sadness, their own performance of grief, already planning the sympathy posts that would rehabilitate their reputations. "We want to honor Dad properly. Maybe we could have a memorial service, something beautiful where everyone can see how much we loved him." The words hit me like physical blows. Honor Dad properly. Show everyone how much they loved him. After 46 years of marriage, after watching this man work himself into the ground for these girls, after seeing him lie in that hospital bed asking for them until his voice gave out, they wanted to perform grief for an audience. "You came to perform grief," I said quietly, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Not to feel it." I closed the door gently, not in anger, but in finality. Not with the slam of rage, but with the soft click of a woman who had finally seen clearly. Through the door, I could hear them talking, their voices rising in confusion and indignation. But their words felt distant now, like voices from another life. I walked back to the living room and sank into George's chair, still wearing his shape, still holding his warmth. And for the first time since he died, I didn't cry. Instead, I remembered. I remembered signing those loan papers for their tuition when George and I could barely afford groceries. My hands had shaken then too, but with hope, not grief. We believed education would give them opportunities we never had, would make them grateful for the sacrifices we made gladly. I remembered sitting at my sewing machine until 3 in the morning, making dress after dress for their school plays, their proms, their graduations. My fingers bleeding from the pins, my back aching from hunching over the fabric, but my heart full because I was giving them something beautiful, something made with love. I remembered waiting outside hospitals during their labor pains, their children's illnesses, their husbands' surgeries. George and I pacing those sterile hallways, offering to help, to cook, to clean, to babysit, to do anything that would ease their burdens. And we did it gladly, because that's what love does. It shows up. It stays. It serves without keeping score. I remembered the gradual cooling, the way their visits became shorter and further apart. The way their phones became more important than our conversations. The way their children stopped calling us grandma and grandpa and started treating us like strangers their parents occasionally visited out of obligation. I remembered crying in silence when they stopped visiting, when birthdays and holidays became excuses they had to escape from rather than celebrations they wanted to share. George would find me in the kitchen, tears falling into whatever I was cooking for just the two of us, and he'd hold me and say, "They'll come around, May. They're just busy building their lives." But I know now what I couldn't admit then. I didn't raise ungrateful daughters. I raised reflections of what I allowed, comfort without consequence. I taught them that my love was unconditional by never setting conditions. I showed them that sacrifice was expected by never asking for anything in return. I demonstrated that their needs mattered more than my own by making myself disappear whenever they needed space. George saw it before I did. In those last weeks, when the cancer was eating him alive and the morphine couldn't touch the pain in his heart, he'd whisper to me about legacy, about what we leave behind. May, he'd say, his voice barely audible, if they forget who we were, remind them. Not with words, but with choices. I thought he meant I should keep telling them stories about their childhood, keep sending them cards and photos, keep trying to bridge the distance they'd created. But sitting in his chair that morning after their performance at my door, I understood what he really meant. The next day, I opened his old drawer, the one where he kept important papers and the letter he'd written to me during his first cancer scare 5 years ago. His handwriting was stronger then, before the treatments took that from him too. May, if they forget who we were, remind them. Not with words, but with choices. Show them what love looks like when it stops begging to be seen. I held that note close to my chest and felt something shift inside me. Not anger, exactly. Not even sadness anymore. Something cleaner, clearer. Something that felt like waking up after a long, exhausting dream. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. "Hello, Thomas? This is May Peterson. I'd like to schedule a meeting to revise my will." Thomas Brennan had been our family lawyer for 20 years. He'd handled the girls' college fund paperwork, their trust accounts, the estate planning George and I had done when we thought we'd grow old surrounded by grateful children and loving grandchildren. "Mrs. Peterson," he said, his voice gentle with condolence. "I'm so sorry for your loss. George was a good man." "Yes, he was," I said. "And that's exactly why I need to make some changes." The meeting was scheduled for the following Monday. 3 days to think, to be sure, to let my daughters prove me wrong if they could. 3 days for them to call and ask about George, about his favorite memories, about what he'd want them to remember. 3 days for them to show up not because the world was watching, but because love requires presence. They didn't call. On Sunday night, Michelle sent a text, "Mom, we're planning a beautiful memorial service for Dad. We've already booked the big chapel at Riverside and hired a photographer to capture everything. We want this to be perfect. We'll call you tomorrow with the details." A photographer. For a memorial service. To capture everything for social media, for their image rehabilitation, For the performance of grief they couldn't deliver when it mattered. I deleted the text without responding. Monday morning came crisp and clear, the kind of autumn day George always loved. I put on my best dress, the navy blue one he'd complimented me in at our last anniversary dinner, and drove to Thomas's office with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. "Mrs. Peterson," Thomas said, rising from behind his mahogany desk. "Please sit. What can I do for you?" I sat down and looked at this man who'd known our family during happier times, who'd drawn up the papers that were supposed to secure our daughters' futures, who'd listened to George and me plan for grandchildren's educations and family reunions that never came. "I want to remove my daughters from my will," I said simply. "All of them. Completely." Thomas's face didn't change. Lawyers learn not to show shock, but I saw his pen pause over his notepad. "Mrs. Peterson, this is a significant decision. Perhaps you'd like some time to—" "I've had 67 years to think about it," I interrupted. 46 years of marriage to a man who died asking for daughters who couldn't spare an afternoon. 3 daughters who didn't come to their father's funeral but showed up the next day worried about their reputations. I've had enough time. What would you like to do with your estate instead? The answer came easily, like George was whispering it in my ear. I want to establish a foundation. For widows who bury their husbands alone. For women who gave everything and were left with nothing but empty chairs and broken promises. Thomas wrote quickly, his pen scratching across the legal pad. "And your daughter's inheritance?" "They'll inherit what they gave their father in his final days," I said. "Nothing." The words felt powerful leaving my mouth, like speaking a truth I'd carried for years without recognizing it. If my daughters could not show up for their father when he was dying, they will not profit from his name when he's dead. We spent 2 hours going over the details. The foundation would be called the George Peterson Memorial Fund for Forgotten Widows. The house would be sold, the proceeds donated. My savings, our retirement accounts, the life insurance George had maintained even when the premium strained our budget, all of it would go to helping women who understood what it meant to love without getting love in return. When I signed the final page, my hand didn't tremble. For the first time in months, I felt steady. The news spread the way gossip always does in small towns, quietly at first, then gathering momentum like a stone rolling downhill. The girls found out from their Aunt Linda, who'd heard it from her hairdresser, who'd gotten it from the receptionist at Thomas's office. Within hours, my phone was ringing constantly. I let it ring. They could perform their panic for empty rooms. I was done being their audience. They showed up at my door on Wednesday evening, all 3 of them together, their faces flushed with outrage and disbelief. This time, I let them in. Not because I owed them explanation, but because I wanted to see who they really were when their inheritance was on the line. "Mom, you can't actually do this," Sarah said, pacing my living room like a caged animal. "Dad wouldn't want this. You know he loved us." I sat in George's chair, my hands folded in my lap, and watched my oldest daughter work herself into a frenzy. "You're right," I said calmly. "Your father did love you. He loved you when you were too busy to visit. He loved you when you forgot his birthday 3 years running. He loved you when you hung up on me the night before he died. He loved you when you couldn't spare 2 hours for his funeral." "That's not fair," Jennifer interrupted, tears streaming down her face. We explained about the kids' schedules, about work commitments. We couldn't just drop everything. "But you could drop everything to come here when your reputations were at stake," I replied. "You could find time to plan a memorial service with photographers when it served your image." Funny how schedules suddenly become flexible when there's something in it for you. Michelle, my youngest, tried a different approach. She knelt beside my chair, taking my hands in hers the way she used to when she wanted something as a child. "Mom, we're sorry. We made mistakes. We were overwhelmed and scared, and we handled it badly. But we're your daughters. We're family. You can't just cut us off." I looked down at her hands holding mine and saw the manicured nails, the expensive rings, the soft palms that had never known the kind of work George and I did to give her those luxuries. Family, I said softly, shows up. Family puts aside convenience when love is needed. Family doesn't abandon dying fathers and then worry about public relations. I pulled my hands free and stood up. You didn't want to be daughters when it was hard. You don't get to be heirs now that it's profitable. They argued for another hour, cycling through tears, anger, bargaining, and more tears. They promised to be better, to visit more, to include me in their lives. They swore they'd learned their lesson, that losing Dad had changed them. But I could see their phones lighting up with notifications even as they pleaded. I could see them checking their social media mentions even as they performed their reform devotion. They hadn't learned anything except that actions have consequences, and they wanted to negotiate their way out of those consequences the same way they'd negotiated their way out of every responsibility their entire adult lives. When they finally left, I sat in the quiet house and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Peace. Not the peace of resignation, but the peace of alignment. For the first time since George's diagnosis, my actions matched my values. The weeks passed quickly after that. The girls tried different strategies. They sent their children to plead with me. They had their husbands call. They even got our pastor involved. But I'd found my backbone, and it felt stronger than their manipulation. The community response surprised me. I'd expected judgment, criticism for cutting off my own daughters. Instead, I found support from unexpected places. Other mothers came forward with their own stories of ungrateful children, of sacrifices unacknowledged, of love taken for granted until the givers finally stopped giving. My neighbor Lorraine brought tea one afternoon and sat in George's chair like she belonged there. "You finally did it, didn't you?" she said, stirring honey into her cup. "Did what?" "Stopped lighting yourself on fire to keep other people warm." I laughed, actually laughed, for the first time since George's funeral. "I didn't seek revenge," I said. "I just stopped offering grace where it was wasted." "That's not revenge," Lorraine said. "That's wisdom." As autumn turned to winter, I began to feel something I'd almost forgotten: contentment. The house felt peaceful instead of empty. Cooking for one felt like self-care instead of loneliness. The silence felt sacred instead of sad. I started working with Thomas on the foundation details. We found a small office space near downtown, hired a part-time coordinator, and began identifying women who needed help. Women whose husbands had died alone in hospitals while their children made excuses. Women whose families had scattered after the funerals, leaving them to grieve in isolation. Women who'd given everything and been left with nothing but bills and broken hearts. The first grant we gave was to Eleanor Martinez, whose husband died of Alzheimer's while their son lived 2 hours away and visited twice in 3 years. We paid for her mortgage for 6 months and connected her with other widows for support. When she cried in gratitude, I saw George's smile in her tears. Spring came early that year, and I found myself in the garden again, planting roses in the same spot George had loved. My hands in the soil felt like prayer, like communion with something larger than my own grief. "I thought I was burying a man," I said to his headstone during one of my weekly visits. I didn't know I was also burying the version of me that begged to be seen. The roses began to bloom in late May, just before what would have been our 47th anniversary. Deep red blooms, the color of enduring love, the color of blood and sacrifice and beauty that comes after pain. I was watering them when I saw a car pull into my driveway. My daughters again, but they looked different this time. Older, more worn. The year had not been kind to them. They approached slowly, almost timidly. The anger was gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine remorse. But I'd learned to distinguish between regret and repentance, between sorrow for consequences and sorrow for actions. "Mom," Sarah said, her voice smaller than I'd heard it since she was 12. "We wanted to talk to you. To really talk, not to ask for anything." I turned off the hose and faced them. They looked tired, defeated in a way that money couldn't fix. Their marriages were struggling, their children were acting out, their perfect lives were revealing the cracks that had always been there. "We've been thinking about Dad a lot," Jennifer said. "About the things he used to say, the way he used to look at us. We remember now the stories he told, the lessons he tried to teach us. We remember what we lost." "And what was that?" I asked. "A father who would have done anything for us," Michelle whispered. "Parents who loved us more than we deserved. A family we threw away because we thought it would always be there." They stood there in my garden, 3 middle-aged women finally understanding what their selfishness had cost them. Part of me wanted to comfort them, to gather them in my arms the way I had when they were small and frightened. But that part of me had died with George, buried under a year of disappointment and abandonment. "You didn't stand by him when it mattered," I said gently. "Why should I stand by you when it's convenient?" I turned back to my roses and continued watering. Behind me, I heard them crying real tears this time, not performed ones. But their tears couldn't water back the love they'd let die, couldn't bloom back the trust they'd crushed under the weight of their own selfishness. When I looked up again, they were gone. Their car was pulling away slowly, and I could see them through the rear window, huddled together in their shared grief. But it was grief for what they'd lost through their own choices, not grief for the father they'd failed to love properly when love was needed. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with applications for our latest foundation grants. Stories of women who'd loved deeply and lost everything, who'd given until they were empty and been abandoned when they needed support. Reading their stories, I felt connected to something larger than my own pain. A sisterhood of women who'd chosen love over convenience, sacrifice over selfishness, and been punished for their devotion. I wrote checks that night until my hand cramped. Each signature felt like justice, like George's love multiplying instead of dying with him. He'd always said the measure of a life wasn't what you accumulated, but what you gave away. Now his legacy was giving women like me the dignity of choice, the power to say no to those who'd taken us for granted. A year later, the George Peterson Memorial Fund had helped 43 women. We'd paid mortgages, covered medical bills, funded grief counseling, and most importantly, reminded forgotten widows that their love had value even when their families couldn't see it. I kept one photo of my daughters on my mantle, a picture from 20 years ago when they still knew how to smile without calculating the audience. Not because I'd forgiven them, but because I wanted to remember who they used to be before they chose comfort over character. People ask me sometimes if I regret my decision, if I miss my daughters, if I wish things had ended differently. The answer is complicated. I miss the daughters I raised, but I don't miss the women they became. I regret their choices, but I don't regret mine. I wish they'd loved their father better, but I'm grateful they showed me who they really were before I wasted any more of my life trying to earn love from people who'd forgotten how to give it. On George's birthday last month, I took roses to his grave and told him about the foundation, about the women we'd helped, about the peace I'd finally found. "We kept our promise, George," I whispered to his headstone. In the end, love showed up even if it wore a stranger's face. The wind was gentle that day, warm with spring promises and new growth. I stood there for a long time, not grieving anymore, but grateful. Grateful for 46 years with a man who knew how to love properly. Grateful for the chance to choose dignity over desperation. Grateful for the wisdom that comes from surviving betrayal with your values intact. When I finally turned to leave, I saw an older woman at a nearby grave, crying alone. I walked over and introduced myself, told her about the foundation, about the community of women who understood her pain. By the time I left the cemetery, she was smiling through her tears, no longer alone in her grief. That's what legacy really looks like, not the money you leave behind, but the love you inspire others to carry forward. George's legacy isn't 3 ungrateful daughters who couldn't be bothered to attend his funeral. His legacy is 43 women who learned they deserved better than being taken for granted, who found the strength to demand respect instead of begging for scraps of affection. If you've ever buried love alone, if you've ever given until you were empty and been criticized for having nothing left to give, if you've ever loved someone more than they loved you and wondered if that made you a fool, let me tell you what I've learned. Silence doesn't mean weakness. Sometimes, it's the sound of peace returning. Sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is stop fighting for people who won't fight for you. Sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is let people experience the consequences of their choices. My daughters live with their regret now, and I live with my peace. They lost a mother who would have given them anything, and I lost daughters who would have taken everything. In the end, I think I got the better deal. The roses George loved are blooming again this year, more beautiful than ever. I tend them every morning, watering them with gratitude instead of tears, watching them grow strong in soil that's been nourished by truth instead of false hope. This is what redemption looks like. Not the restoration of broken relationships, but the restoration of self-respect. Not the return of ungrateful children, but the discovery that you were whole before they left and you're still whole after they're gone. Sometimes, the most powerful love story is learning when to stop waiting for love that's never coming home.